Welcome back to the podcast, Evelyn. I am so excited to have you. This topic that we have discussed last time, or we started to talk about a little bit about MKUltra. I am really interested in what you have to say, and also wanted to say a little nervous. I have to be honest with you to talk about these types of things and start to kind of uncover them, but my curiosity is really getting the best of me. So, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, it's not an easy topic to talk about. It's certainly seedy and nefarious, and I maybe for some people might be a little hard to digest.
Yeah. What's so interesting to me in some of the research I did after we spoke was not so much the history of when it started, which I would like to dive into, but the use that could be happening today with different, whether it's celebrities or people in power of some kind, to when they start to kind of, I don't know, descend, if you will, into what seems like a manic state, right? It really does bring into question what's really going on, you know?
Right. Yes. And the fact that the CIA has been working with the unconscious mind and mind control programs since the 50s. So this is a long time. This is 75 years of research and data collection. Um, just goes to show that there's so much happening that we're not privy to for the public. And there very well could be agents in Hollywood, celebrities, people who are planted to propagate or germinate certain beliefs or ideas to persuade cultural ideas and beliefs.
Right. And what seems to be, something that started as a way to test different drugs and different theories using the element of consciousness on humans back in the day. It kind of is evolved to, somebody who goes to see a psychiatrist, and perhaps we don't know what type of drugs they're being given, and is that why they're acting so strange, right? So
Right.
there's this interesting correlation between my research and doing um, from just some of the things that were tested back in the early, not even the early 50s. Was it the early 50s that this all started?
Yeah, it started in the 50s. And the early 50s, and officially in 1953 is when the MK Ultra project itself became official. So it's been, yeah, quite a long time. It apparently was disbanded in the 70s.
Mhm.
That's what the CIA says. Before they destroyed all the papers.
And was it moved to now let's start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about how MKUltra started and what they were doing and using on patients that were coming for treatment, such as constant migraines, let's say.
So yeah, the in the 50s, 1953, the MK Ultra program was headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb or Gottlieb. I don't know how to exactly pronounce his name. And it was started on the order of CIA Director Alan Dulles. And this was all in response to fears regarding Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind control on the soldiers that had been taken during wartime. So it was more of a propagation out of fear of other countries' advancement with their technological understanding around consciousness and mind control. And they really wanted to create or understand how to control minds, control behaviors, They were looking for a truth serum, which they used a plethora of drugs to find or to experiment with on unsuspecting clients of psychological disorders.
Right.
So people would go in for anxiety or depression, talking to a therapist or who they thought was just a general practitioner. Unbeknownst to them, they're actually in collusion with the CIA as a guinea pig to be tested on for these intense, heavy psychotropic drugs.
Right. Right. And it wasn't just drugs, correct?
They used hypnosis, torture, various torture techniques. They basically had no restrictions whatsoever. There was no law there was no law at the time that barred the United States government from experimenting on its own citizens until the 70s.
Was it till the 70s?
Yes.
Mm. So from some of the reading and research I was doing, they were using everything like you were saying, from drugs to sound to frequencies to all sorts of things, where they would even, go as far as play a certain fear that a person would have under the person's pillow for 3 month time period as they slept at night, right? To see the effects it would have. And a lot of these people were coming out totally reverting back to childhood states.
Mhm. There were
Right.
people who forgot their names. There were people who forgot who their parents were. There were people who thought that the researchers were their parents, and these researchers are, you know, they don't know how to revert memories back. So a lot of these patients became permanently damaged because of these experiments. And the drugs that they used everything. They used heroin, morphine, temazepam, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, marijuana, alcohol, sodium pentothal, which is actually a short-acting drug that induces hypnosis within 10 to 20 minutes. And then also the ergot, which I thought was really interesting. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. And it's actually been contributed to the whole witch trial scare in Salem,
Mm.
because the whole town, there's a researcher that has a theory that the town was under the effect of ergot poisoning. And that's why a lot of people were showing signs of, it's like zombie-like behavior, where you are just kind of in a daze and you can't think straight, and it can cause the mass hysteria. So it's interesting. They also studied that.
Well, and
And
I was reading a lot about LSD being used as well.
yes, LSD. That's the big one for sure, which it's interesting because the CIA inadvertently has created so many subcultures in the United States and in the world. And the whole 60s hippie movement is contributed to the CIA.
So do you believe it started? Because I know Dennis Leary, really started his program at Harvard. What was it back in the 60s?
Or Timothy Leary.
Did I say I do this all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, Timothy Leary, not the actor, Dennis Leary. But
Yes.
I do that quite often, I apologize. Yes, so was he connected to the CIA in any way, or was that just because it was research that was funded through Harvard and his research he was doing there?
Yeah, so a lot of people were actually associated with these programs. Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, worked in the facility where they were testing on patients and became a patient himself. And that book was actually inspired by his experience in that facility. And so him and Timothy Leary synced up and they created this whole culture of um, this new paradigm shift that we have to, I think, I guess, think in some ways that have opened doors to what's possible with our consciousness, which I think is like a Pandora's box that the CIA had no idea that they were contributing to. And then also the guitarist for the Grateful Dead was also
Jerry
one of
Garcia?
the.
Was it Jerry Garcia, or is that the lead singer?
It wasn't him, it was the writer, the yeah, one of the main writers. I can't remember his name. But he was also a test subject too. There were many people who were test subjects because it spanned across the whole country. There were over 80 facilities that were a part of this program, colleges, hospitals, mental health facilities. So it was just widespread.
And it's so interesting. I mean, as you describe it, the visions I get and what I got from, I guess, doing some of the reading on the MKUltra was you mentioned One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but it really does bring out back images of Clockwork Orange, where they were doing that moment where they were holding his eyes open and then playing that music, that Mozart,
Mhm.
Beethoven. I forget the exact music they were constantly playing that would eventually, when he heard the music, drive him mad,
Yep.
right? So it seems so uh, just insane to think that they were able to test all these things on people, and I mean, still to this day, it's almost like washed under the rug or swept under the rug. Um,
Mhm.
there was also some correlation between Stranger Things, right? And Stranger Things, and then the use of these mechanisms, which is where I think Elle's mom, right? I don't know if you've watched it, but her mom kind of reverts back to this state where she can only say 7 words
Oh, I didn't notice
her
that.
entire life, right? It was like rainbow, daisy,
Oh, yes.
right? And
Yeah.
they had taken the baby, taken L, 11, and then basically claimed she was insane, claimed she told her daughter that she killed herself or whatever, but she went insane and she was back in that state. So that is that show does a great representation of what was actually going on.
100%. Yeah. And so there's another program that is not verified yet that is still a documented conspiracy theory, which is called Project Monarch. And Project Monarch is what you're speaking to, which is the heavy use of those torture experiments to create super soldiers or superhuman versions of us. And this is where it gets dark. And this is where it gets pretty hard to stomach because it's this program. There's been a few victims that have spoken out that have done interviews that you can find their interviews in their books online. They've been, I do not know if they've been even discredited by the government or anyone. They just speak out, and it's really fascinating. But there's also a few psychiatrists that work with mind control victims, and it's classified as mind control ritual abuse victims.
Okay. Do you have
So
any names or any books that you know of?
I do. I have one book, but it's not at all for general consumption whatsoever. This is a book that is only for people who are working with clients because it is very detailed and it can trigger responses in people if they have unhealed trauma. So it's not recommended for anyone who could potentially have had any traumatic experiences like this. But it's called Healing the Unimaginable, Treating Ritual Abuse and Mind Control.
Mm.
And This book goes into detail with her work with mind control victims. It goes into the actual process, how they're programmed, and how these victims can be layered. She also is very controversial because she claims that dissociative identity disorder is a manufactured disorder and did not exist before these mind control programs started.
So what is that? What's dissociated? What is it?
Dissociated identity disorder, so
Okay,
DID for short, and it's a term used to describe multiple personality disorder.
I see.
Yes. So her claim is that multiple personality disorder is only created through traumatic ritual abuse.
Mm,
Because what it does, like what you were mentioning before, having it's basically you break the person down psychologically to the point where they have no concept of self, no
okay.
concept of identity or who they are as a person through those techniques that we're talking about, like keeping their eyes open and watching, horrific,
Image.
horrendous images nonstop 24/7 for days on end, like, you know, isolation tactics, deprivation, all sorts of horrible things. And then when you break someone down to a point where they are basically a shell of a person, or essentially their soul has left the body, you program new personalities. And then you lock that personality in with a name or a keyword or a song or some sort of association so that that personality can be brought out at any given moment.
Oh, wow.
So the purpose of that is to do things such as, and they use hypnosis techniques to do that. So one purpose is to have someone be able to act out either a murder or even speak to like a government official without having any recollection or knowledge of what they're doing. So the idea is that, the less horrendous one would be programming someone to have a memory or information to deliver that information to a government official and then immediately forgetting that they even knew it or had that information to begin with.
Crazy. So it would be used as a way to control them in one situation, and then they're totally not conscious of it.
Right. So they're like mules and they're it's a perfect way to get information cross borders or safely without using phones or emails or any technology. And they don't know anything. So even if they got caught or if they got trapped by the other government, then under interrogation, they wouldn't have any idea. Because the only way that they would be able to get that information out is through like the keyword or the trigger word or the certain like pattern to get that memory unlocked.
How easy is it to do that to someone? Would be my question.
I think it takes I have no idea, to be honest. These are just educated guesses, and my educated guess is that it's very dependent on the person. Like, you have to get someone who is very easily hypnotizable or easily dissociated. So it's probably going to be someone who has gone through significant trauma as a child, or who maybe automatically dissociates naturally throughout their lives.
Right.
And then with their techniques, I don't know, you know, depends on if they're kidnapping them at night, right? And then doing it for a few hours and then bringing them back to their home. Which also, when we get into this Project Monarch, like digging into Project Monarch, there's a theory that alien abductions are actually false memories implanted into MKUltra victims.
Interesting. Because that's, I mean, I've done so much research more recently with Dolores Cannon's work, and her past life regressions of people who have been abducted. And I find it very fascinating and very, um, I don't know, like it's been consistent. So are they able to use that as like, oh, you're being, like, they almost place it in, how do they use it? How would they use?
So they replace a false memory of the abduction.
Mhm.
So that if they are hypnotized, for instance, by a hypnotist, or they do therapy work with a therapist, they'll only draw out this false memory, and they
Oh,
won't be able to get below that memory, and that will be sort of their just base level for, what experience they had.
okay. So it's almost like they revert back to they were abducted by aliens versus this was something that happened here on Earth. By
Yes. Yeah.
and then what percentage, of this was happening to children versus adults? Do you know?
I don't know that, but it really does make me, it makes my mind wander, right? It makes me start to think about that, uh, children abductions, missing children's cases that go unresolved,
Yeah.
um, you know, the underground, um, human trafficking trade that exists with
Right.
the world
Yeah.
globally. Because there's a big price tag for bodies for various reasons and for many different groups, not just the CIA or the government or military, but also just um, you know, sex trafficking, that whole thing. They use ritual abuse tactics and hypnosis for their victims as a way to control them. Mobs or gangs that want to have or create a type of militant follower, or it's, like a cult like following, so that they have a total dedication and loyalty.
Right.
um, it's just like, how do you get anyone to do something against their own will or
Mm.
against their own moral judgment? Which my belief is that majority of people have a moral compass that you have to get beyond in order to get them to do something horrendous or some sort of act that goes against their value system. So they use those sorts of torture techniques to get someone to essentially devalue themselves and move beyond their moral worldview.
Right. So this was going on through the 70s, but I believe it moved up to Canada, right? They ended up starting this research up in Canada.
They did, yes. They used a lot of Canadians. There was, um, a lot of research happening there
Mhm.
as well, and I've watched one documentary or one interview with the child of a victim of a mind control, test patient, and he said his father's, you know, his memory is shot.
Yeah.
He can't remember anything. It's sad the government hasn't said anything about it or even given any retribution or apologies. It's like they just completely washed their hands of it and just said, "Oh, not enough people are talking about it, or not enough people are outraged enough to do anything or get some sort of."
Right, because it's
Yeah.
still kind of like even with all the knowledge of it happening and being shown through movies and books and whatnot, it's still not happening in every household, right? So, or so removed that people are somewhat detached from the idea that it would even be going on, and what control do we really have to stop it?
Mhm.
You know,
Mm.
that's my That's my thought behind it. And I think was he the one was he one of the Canadian ones where the dad reverted back to his childlike self? Was that
Yep.
one? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, they played him that was the one who they played the hours of this frequency under his pillow for, like, 3 months or 6 months time period, and I'm sure they did other things as well. He went in for anxiety, like, mild anxiety, um, and that's what he how he was how he came out.
Mhm.
It's wild, and then in the 1980s, you think with the Reagan administration, they closed down all the mental health facilities.
Yep.
A lot of the people who have been damaged either by this or other, whether it's my brother has schizophrenia, whether it's something that is born, they're born with, or it's something where they were doing the testing at a lot of these sites, they got all shut down, and
Mhm.
a lot of these people ended up out on the street.
Yep. So in the 70s, the only reason why all of this came to light was through a New York Times article in that came out in 1974, I believe. Um, and it detailed all the illegal and unethical activities that the CIA was doing on American citizens with MKUltra. I think it's so, and ironically though, a year before that, the CIA director ordered all documents to be burned. So in 1973, all the documents had been wiped out, and there's only a handful left, which I've looked through some of these documents, and they don't detail techniques because
Right.
that's what I'm really trying to find. Like, I really want to know, okay, well, where is the hypnosis? Obviously, as a hypnotist, like, I want to know what type of hypnosis work they were doing on people or what techniques they were using. They don't detail any of it. It's more just like the day to day or what they're going to do or what they're trying to see. It's like very surface stuff, but we only have like, yeah, maybe like 20 or so documents that have anything to do with MKUltra. All of them are gone. And this is if it started in 1950, this is
Yeah.
20 years of
Oh,
information.
yeah, of material. And if you think about too, it's like if they're using LSD and, psilocybin, I mean, talk about some of the most I mean, not only does it open up your consciousness in a certain way, it if you start doing things to the mind at that stage when the person is under that type of drug, I mean, you can easily alter
Mhm,
the state.
mhm. Yes. So, they definitely opened a Pandora's box. I think these sorts of drugs that they were using are plants. They're herbs that are traditionally used in spiritual practices around the world in South America, in Central America,
Like
and so
psilocybin and uh
the
but
sil
LSD I mean, it's man-made, right?
LSD is man-made. So like, you know, marijuana, psilocybin, I don't know if ergot might have also been used, but it's these elements that are naturally derived from plants
Mhm.
that are used traditionally in ways that are respectable to earth and nature, and there's a symbiotic relationship to merging consciousness with these substances in a way that is intentional. And just the way that the CIA and the government used it was it was like pillaging something sacred for such a egregious act and paranoia,
Mhm.
that it's
Right. Absolutely, but there was another story I read where it was, they gave someone a high dosage of LSD. It was either LSD or psilocybin, and then flooded his body with heroin, and then took the heroin off, did more LSD, and, like, just kept going back and forth. This person
yeah.
did not survive. I mean, and to think that, there would be a different outcome, to me, it's like, common sense at this point. But they were, flooding in high dosages as well. It wasn't just like, "Oh, we're going to try a micro dose of this." But this does bring me back to the idea of what's been going on now, and the idea that, people should be microdosing for trauma. And so
Mm,
a lot of this has come back to, there's been a lot of talk about, people are already doing the microdosing for PTSD and all these little, all these things, depression. And I can't say here or there if it's the right thing or the wrong thing for the person. It's each his own. But what I'm starting to understand is the government is now starting to see, oh, wait a second, we should start trials of this, right? Well, we should start doing more studies around this, and now, putting it back in a hospital setting. Now I go both ways on this, because the idea of, like, somebody who really truly needs treatment and doing ibogaine, let's say, down in Mexico in a treatment facility where it's administered and you're on a heart monitor and all those things, that all makes sense to me. But when you put it in the hands of government, that's where it starts for me to just be like the most red flags of anything. It's like that would be the worst idea possible. I don't know if there's another way to go about it that's privatized or something else, but you're putting it back into this interesting into the hands of the CIA, FBI, all these government administrations where they've already shown to do this type of testing, to utilize things in ways which they can change people the way people think.
well, I guess if it makes you feel any better, they've probably already done it and they're not interested because they've already found ways to
True. It's
influence the
Yeah,
public.
that's true. I think that there's a lot of funding though that's now being given to plant medicine, and
Yeah.
not in ways of, Rogan was talking about this. I don't even know who was talking. It was somebody who was behind psilocybin, and they were talking about how they were bringing it, institutionalizing it again. And
Yeah.
that is just something to be aware of, when we're talking about the government, and yes, they have already done this stuff for years. We're talking about going back to that kind of weight where people give their sovereignty away. Like, hey, yes, sure, test this on me. I have this wrong with me, this wrong with me, this wrong with me, instead of
Mhm.
maybe having a more spiritual connection to it. Maybe doing it in a way that is more uh, aligned, or could be even safer, in my opinion, to the person. But
Yeah, right. Because when they were testing LSD on people, it was in a clinical room. They were strapped to tables. They had bright lights shot, like they were in bright, sterile environments that would make anyone go crazy. And back to what you were saying, the one guy did die because he jumped out of a window because he went absolutely bonkers because they
CIA,
dosed him.
right?
He was
Yeah.
a CIA agent, and they dosed him without his knowledge, which we know, ethically and, the etiquette is that's horrible to do to anybody, to ever dose anyone with any substance without their knowledge, because they can just crack and not know what is going on. It totally changes your perception of reality. Um, and so the dosing itself, yes, and the setting in which you put yourself in, the environment that it's administered plays a huge role in the way that your psyche is going to interact with the substance.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, the I think, methamphetamines and heroin that they used. Methamphetamines, it wasn't synthesized until 1890s. And neither was heroin. Heroin and methamphetamine didn't become what they are now until the 1890s. And so it was on the market as sort of these therapeutic drugs at certain doses.
Do
And
you
then
mean the 1980s? Or do you mean
1890. Yeah.
90s? When
So
did it when did it really come out? It was being used, like, in pharmaceutical ways? You mean in the 1800s? Wow.
I think it was probably more so in the early 1900s.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the early 1900s, it was in, what was it, like Tylenol, or,
Mm.
Advil had
Meth.
codeine in it, and yeah, had meth in it. I saw an advertisement, an old advertisement recently that was like marijuana, alcohol, meth, and like codeine for a cough suppressant.
It is so high. I don't even understand. Like,
Like, that will
horrible.
definitely suppress your cough.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
sure.
exactly. Somebody overdoses when they, just by taking cough medicine. That's insane.
And Coca-Cola had
Mhm.
cocaine in it.
Full cocaine
Um,
in it. I mean, that would have been back in the day. I wonder if anybody saved any, you know? Like, I wonder if anybody still has some, like, old Coke from the early 1900s.
oh,
That'd be
that would be something to crack open at the end of the last day.
day on Earth.
The
Yeah.
last
Well, I would imagine that might be worth some money now, to be honest.
Right, right. So, and going back to when the New York Times article broke about all of this and it became public knowledge that these experimentations were happening, um, who was it that was in office at that time? I believe it was for Richard or President Ford. So in 1976, President Ford issued the first executive order on intelligence activities, the first ever, prohibiting experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with informed consent,
Mm.
in writing with a witness. So that was the first time, 1976, where like, maybe you shouldn't be testing on people without their knowledge.
Right.
That's maybe not ethical.
What do you think about I don't even know if I wanna bring this into it, but, like, the idea that the trials and the testing for, the recent vaccinations didn't have proper, uh, trials prior to it, and that they were able to still roll it out to the public. Now, did you have to sign something to get that vaccination? Like, sign something that would say, like, I acknowledge that this is still in testing because it was an emergency authorization?
I'm not sure. I don't know all the legalities with
Yeah,
that.
I don't either. It crossed my mind when you just said that they passed something then that you would have to
Right.
have informed consent. Oh, I'm curious to know how that loophole if people had to sign something.
Right. And I don't, that would be interesting to look into. Um, but yeah, no, I definitely remember it got rushed through, even though the trials were still kind of underway. It was kind
Yeah,
of like they're just like, yeah, let's just get
let's just do
ASAP.
it. Let's do it now.
Gotta get
But
there.
but I think because it didn't even have a proper FDA approval, right? So that's why I'm like, I wonder if because that would have meant that some of the people who got it during that time would have been being tested on, right? Would have
Unless they decided that it wasn't, unless there's some sort of legal terminology that didn't deem it as a test, some
as
sort
like
or
a trial.
yeah, or a trial. because they did have trials. I do remember that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but so yeah, I'm not sure about like I'm sure there's some legal terminology around that.
Just a side note. So in 1974 that passed, or 1970.
1976. Yes. Yeah, so some of these things, there's a list of goals that they had that I thought was really interesting, and one that really popped out to me in terms of what the one of the main goals was for all of these CIA tests with MK Ultra was um, substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public.
Interesting. That feels like that's been used more recently.
Yes. And that's the number one. That was the first goal that's listed by the agency with these testings. They wanted to find substances that they could put in people that would make them go crazy, make them look stupid in public so that they could be discredited if they needed to just, you know, get them off of the radar, just have the public opinion. What I've realized through all of this research is the purpose of the CIA is solely to persuade public opinion and alter cultural beliefs in various governments around the world
Right.
through propaganda and lies, coercion, mind control, and manipulation everywhere, just for the sake of whatever the goal is, for whatever that purpose is. I have to also mention this before we go on, before I forget.
Yeah.
So, who were the scientists that were initiating these studies?
I don't.
There's so there's this project called Project Paperclip, which some people may be familiar with. But so Project Paperclip was the process of the United States adopting convicted scientists that were previously, yes, that were previously convicted under the Nuremberg trials for World War II Nazi unethical testing.
Mm.
So these were Nazi scientists. These are Nazi scientists that were used for these studies.
Yeah, and I mean it makes complete sense if if you think about it. I mean the timeline makes sense for sure. We
Mhm.
brought these people over here after World War II, and we act like, I think the US has this kind of high and mighty opinion of that were like we went in and stopped World War II. We stopped Hitler and brought the Jews out of this horrible situation when
Yeah.
we absorbed and adopted all their tactics and
Mm.
brought the people who were part of creating that into our government.
And then used those same tactics on our own citizens.
Right.
So it's egregious. It's horrendous that they did that. And then based off of those studies, all these other programs and all these other tests, like what you're mentioning, the audio sound, um, audio weaponry, which is now being used. And we see all these diplomats with Havana syndrome, for instance, that are being victims of directed energy weapons. That's
Right.
yeah, in Cuba, yes. That's originated from all the studies that happened during the MK Ultra program. So it evolved. It didn't, they disintegrated it, but it evolved into all these other facets of research for mind control techniques.
Okay, so if it stopped in the 1970s, do you think it could be still going on under different different names or different organizations, or just it kind of rebranded itself, if you will?
Yeah, 100%. And it just went off into these smaller projects to see how, right, directed energy weapons affect human consciousness or how it can control human behavior. There's still testing on citizens for, you know, who knows, maybe all the delegates or the ambassadors, US ambassadors from Cuba were being tested on by their own government,
Mm.
you know, which
Do you think
um
that was US? You think that was US versus it being Cuban?
I think it's the perfect place to do it without being suspected of it because
The smoking gun kind of a
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different theories, especially with, over the course of the past 3 years with the fast rollout of 5G frequency, the people who had spoken out about that in like 2018 and 2019 in regards to that same frequency being used in wars,
Mhm,
used to use that frequency specifically for wars because it's one that can penetrate the human body, basically.
mhm.
Um, so all sorts of things, but it all gets placed under, oh, that's just hearsay. This is safe for humans. Oh, this is, I feel like it could just be almost like a mass testing where it's like people don't even know it's happening, but it's been going on.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so let's see, some of these other goals that they had, for instance, was to test substances which increase the efficiency of perception, and memory or cognition, and also to test materials which will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way so that they may be used for malingering, etc. Testing, materials which will render the induction of hypnosis easier or otherwise enhance its usefulness. Substances which will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture, and coercion during interrogation. Um, Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia, material which will cause mental confusion of such a type that the individual under its influence will find it difficult to maintain a fabrication under questioning. So a lot of it was like to create basically super soldiers that could be interrogated under any circumstance and not break ever.
Right.
Um, Also, let's see what else we have. Oh, a material which can be surreptitiously administered, secretly administered by the above routes, and which in very small amounts will make it impossible for a man to perform any physical activity whatsoever. So just to incapacitate him completely.
Insane.
Oh, a substance which will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts.
I wonder what that one is.
Fluoride, perhaps?
Does fluoride do that?
Fluoride,
It makes you, but it doesn't it block your third eye, your pituitary gland? Is that's the
yeah, which is your ambition and your motivation. And it creates passivity,
does it?
yeah, and complacency.
Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm thinking more like uh fentanyl and all the stuff going on that they're flooding the
Oh,
system with, right? Flooding
right.
the country with,
Yeah,
right?
and also we could probably thank the CIA for our current drug
Oh,
epidemic.
110%. They don't want to do anything about it. As a matter of fact, I think that's why the borders are as they are. I mean,
Because
it's
majority of
flooding through.
yeah, because everyone's already incapacitated with narcotics. When, like you said, they shut down all of the mental health facilities, they were all being tested on with intense doses of heroin, methamphetamines, um, painkillers, and then they let them all out into the street with all these addictions. What do you think is going to happen? And now here we are with a huge mental health crisis, drug epidemic that was manufactured completely.
Oh, I 110% agree. And you know, the prescribing of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication that's gone through the roof. I mean, we've it's been bad, but now it's like it's insane. And then the all the shooters that come out, like these mass shooters who are on these medications,
Mhm,
it's like if we're not seeing the connection between the two, right? I mean, antidepressants, that's exactly what they do. They legitimately slow you down. They slow you down into a state that makes your life numb, but like manageable. Like you
mhm.
don't feel all the lows and you don't but so that means you really don't feel the highs because you're kind of just
Yeah.
with it. And I can say this just from having my son, who is 21, go through all these different types of medications as well as had that fentanyl. He was addicted to fentanyl for 2.5 years, and I had just had to go through
Mhm,
that. And I also know that this not only the state but the county doesn't want to do anything about
mhm,
this. You know, you can call the police with all the information and they say they can't do anything to arrest the dealers, to arrest anyone involved, nothing.
wow.
And so it's just feeding this crazy, I don't even know it's almost like getting worse and worse and worse and we're just watching it and then they're saying, "Okay, well you can get off of this, but we're going to put you on anti-anxiety medication and we're going to put you on Klonopin and we're going to put you on antidepressant." And so you mix these things up and your child, your kid or your husband or your brother or your sister or whatever starts to become very different than what they would be if they were not exposed to any of it and just,
Mhm.
you know, purely on their own brain capacity. It's it's heartbreaking. And so what you have to do is, you know, and I've kept him, he's sober now, he's been 6 months sober, but like
Mhm,
kept him off of, encouraged him to stay off of, even though the doctors keep trying to prescribe all these antidepressant medications, been able to keep him off of it so he understands you have to start to be able to process your emotions.
mhm,
Because the more we repress our emotions, and this is just the, you know, coming from our own wellness community and our own spirituality, the more we repress our emotions, the more they just metastasize in our bodies. So eh, I absolutely believe that the government uh, was a part of, you know, curating and figuring out ways to make antidepressant drugs and things that are highly addictive. You know, when I got off of Effexor in in my late 20s, they said, "Oh, that's just like getting off of heroin." And you're
mhm.
thinking, so getting off of an antidepressant is the same as getting off of heroin? Like that doesn't even correlate, right? That it just it blew my mind to think that my doctor was telling me that.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I
this
definitely feel similarly, but I wanna be careful that if antidepressants are needed, that it's not vilified or, um, seen as,
oh,
like, a taboo for anyone who needs it, because I know I've definitely benefited from, antidepressants myself. I'm not currently on an antidepressant, but I have in the past, and without it, I probably wouldn't be here. So I think that, yeah, while it does get you to a space where you can just level out, right? It gets you to a space where you can, like, just cope with what you have to cope with while you get the rest of your life in order. it's like a it's like someone's holding your hand along the way. And then, sometimes we feel like maybe we don't need that anymore and we can take the steps to get off of it. Sometimes we can't. But I do agree that it is like a coping mechanism for a certain amount of time. And then once you come off of it, yeah, there are the things that are still there that you have to feel in your physical body in a different way or navigate neurologically, which is very confusing and complicated.
And I'm definitely not saying to anyone listening or anyone out there, stop your medication by any means. I just want to start to understand why things are so overly prescribed to a
Right,
point where some people they don't really need these things and they actually need a different route versus a blanket statement. I feel like at one point in everyone's life, they're going to have a time that they have to face where these two are tools and you can utilize them throughout, right? Some people need them for their whole lives. I can't, I would never vilify or argue with any of that. It's just I want to start to understand how how our pharmaceutical industry connected to our government, connected to some of these different experiments that have happened, to keep people in a state where they're easily
right. To that point, it reminds me of this cartoon that I saw that has been going around where there's two people in lab suits in a forest that had just been cut down, and there's a koala bear like clinging onto this stump, like with these like tension signals around its body, and they're like, look, that koala bear is anxious. It must be suffering from anxiety. It's
right,
like,
right, because his environment has been totally, yeah, taken, blown up.
right. Yeah, it is. It's environmental, it's cultural, it's systemic, it's it's all the things that we have to deal with on a daily basis to feel comfortable and alive. And it's probably manufactured that way. And
Oh,
it's
yeah,
manufactured that way so that we don't have time, we don't have energy, we don't have it just resources to even think about, you know,
yeah,
the fighting against the systems that are creating our our anxiety and depression to
yes.
begin with.
I mean, I can't even say that I haven't needed them, right? Because I needed them all through my 20s when, I was left with a child when I was 22,
Mm,
and it was the most painful experience to be able to bring me out of it. Um, was an antidepressant called
yeah.
Effects, and that was able to give me enough uh,
Mm,
strength to be the mother that I needed to be during those years. Because if
mm,
I didn't, I mean, just being in that emotional depression state for such a consistent amount of time, I mean, yeah, that alone can wear on you and it
mm,
can make you not want to be here anymore, not want to function anymore. And so I totally am on board with some safety net and some sort of a um, help, being able to get help properly and being able to trust your doctors and be able to trust who you're getting the information from.
yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think about getting more information because if my doctor was my uncle at the time, and if he had told me the steps of how to get off of that one, I might have
Mm,
tried a different one. You know,
right. Yeah.
because
I
it
have
ended up
heard
taking me 3 years to get off of it. So
yeah, I have heard Effexor is I think I took it also, was pretty intense. Effexor is a pretty strong one. But yeah, to go back to the ways in which like these shooters, for instance, um, if we could potentially maybe, in some ways, maybe there's some sort of link. Maybe there's some sort of link for these shooters and maybe Project Monarch. The
Mm,
Unabomber
right.
was also a test subject.
That's right. Wasn't that's
Yeah.
right. Ted, 'cause I don't mess up his
Kaczynski.
last name. Zinsky.
Yeah. Yeah, he was also a test subject, and he is very famous for being the Unabomber. He was a genius. He was a child genius. He was a mathematician and went in to get studied and tested. And I think actually because of that, because of the tests with LSD, he gained a more radical belief around industrialization and its like pillaging of the environment. And so it turned him into kind of a radical hermit who ended up living in the woods
Right.
for the rest of his life, and wrote about how industrialization is destroying the world. And so a radical hippie, I would say.
Didn't he do this though? I mean, there was conspiracy around this, I know, because there was something else going on at the time of the Unibombing. It was like, oh, I'm gonna have to do more I know it was almost like the day before there was a judgment in the Supreme Court, or there was something that happened that I don't know if it was his response to it or if it was almost like a way to deflect from this other thing passing
Hmm.
or happening, because it took all the news into that direction from whatever was happening here. So there was some conspiracy around, yes, he was all those things, but perhaps he had been used and used as a way to used and given some form of information to do this bombing while something else was going on. I
Hmm.
I need to I will do more research. I read a story about it and I thought that was really interesting. Because I was starting to read a lot about I wanted to kind of read about the brainwashing of society, and I did this a little previous podcast on it, and how we're led to believe things in these ways because we're just distracted by another thing that's happening, and then this thing's happening in the background. So I think, uh, I mean, you're right on all the things. I didn't realize he was tested on by the CIA. I knew he was like a part of something in the CIA.
Yeah, he was one of the test subjects. He's probably one of the more, well, no, they're all pretty influential, but yeah, he is one of the test subjects. But so yeah, I'm just looking at his history because I also don't know too much. This was before my time, I suppose, but I guess he had a series of bombs that he sent to various institutions and various people, specifically targeting people with his bombs.
Mm.
Um, I don't know why they were targeted. I don't know what the purpose is, so I'm not sure. But he wrote a very long manifesto that you can read that I think is actually pretty interesting, about industrial society and its future. And it's, like I said, just kind of about probably things that we are concerned about today in
Right.
terms of like industrialization, the devaluing of human consciousness and freedoms. Um, but the reason why I bring them up, because I think it's interesting that this Project Monarch program was studying how to create super soldiers and how to create basically any sort of patsy for government use. And this is where we get into like the celebrity mind control theories of like there's all these celebrities in Hollywood that are actually Project Monarch victims, mind control victims, and sometimes they go off the rails, right? And then sometimes they get to a certain level where they're talking about things they shouldn't talk about, and then they have a decline or a mental health fall, and then they're discredited in the public eye. um for the things that they're saying. And I think Kanye West is one of the more recent ones.
That was, yes, I was gonna mention you. So you think he was a part of, he knew about this, or he was unaware of this was actually going on?
Well, they say he's diagnosed bipolar. So, that definitely causes a lot of the symptoms that he exhibits, which is like grandiosity of self and like kind of delusions of grandeur, but and like super highs, super lows. But he also is very outspoken about certain things that the government has
Oh,
done. If you read it, like listen to his past interviews, he also says just a lot of stuff. So you have to parse through kind of a lot of his what he says. But there's also this theory that every single time an MKUltra victim or mind control victim gets committed, they come out with their hair. There's something about their hair or their identity that gets changed. Like Britney Spears shaved off her hair. Kanye West came out with bleach blonde hair for some reason when he came out of when he was committed for his mental breakdown. Amanda Bynes also is another one that was committed. She's a child star, and it's always these child stars too that get to a certain point. And also there's this kind of program that people seem to follow with celebrities where they're used a certain way up to a certain age, and then they hit a certain age and then they become like over sexualized, and then get used a different way, and then become kind of like a sex kitten, they call them. And then like sometimes they have mental breakdowns, sometimes they keep going, but then there's always some sort of institutionalization, and they come out with like a change of hair or just a change of clothing, and it's almost as if they want to completely get rid of the thing that identifies them.
okay. So do you
Mhm.
think, like, would you think they were under that since the time became they were created into the celebrity they were through some form of control mechanism, or they started to go off the rails and then were pilled? Like this idea that then they were given, "Oh, just, you know what? Just take her out because she's now it's just make her sound crazy." I mean, you watch Britney Spears stuff now and you're like, "What in the who's controlling the social media of this girl?" Right? It's
Yeah.
really hard to watch because not only she 40 some years old, she also has children. Like what's really going on?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That is such a mind trip. She's definitely one of the subjects that people would deem to be an MK Ultra victim. And usually it's from a young age. Like they're utilized at a young age, they're programmed, they have handlers, they have people that are just always around that just watch to oversee who they talk to, what they say, who they're allowed to talk to, or how much freedom they have. And then they get into this like, and then she got into the conservatorship, which completely took away any control whatsoever for her to make any decisions over her own life. And I think what's happening now is whoever is in control of her Instagram account, I think is kind of like, oh, see, look, she does need to be controlled. Like she does need
Mm,
someone to handle her because she can't obviously take care of herself.
right.
Um, so I think there's still a bunch of weird stuff going on there that we just don't know yet.
Yeah. 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 Or maybe that's her self expression and we just haven't seen it until now. You know?
Or
Like, she's free, and so she's like, I'm going to try on every outfit in my closet and dance for you guys." That and that it the hard part is maybe not where's her but it's almost like where's her best friend?
mm,
You want your best friend to tell you, like, "Hey, I know you think it's cute, but, like, it's a little
mm.
much," like.
Unless she's trying to destroy her
Right,
image herself because she just doesn't want
that
that fame anymore.
that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense, for sure.
Mhm.
Um, so and yeah, Kanye, yes. I mean, that is gotten to the point where but I think the same type of thing happened to Chappelle.
Right. Yes. Yeah. He went underground for years.
Mhm.
Some say he went to Africa, I think.
That's the story. Yeah.
Yeah. He went to Africa. I mean, it doesn't seem like he's mind controlled because he's pretty much saying what he thinks and what he feels pretty openly, and it doesn't seem to follow a rhetoric.
Right, right. I think it's more just as somebody does speak out. So the first thing that you were listing that MK Ultra was trying to accomplish would be to discredit people,
Right.
um, to be able to find a solution to discredit people when they needed to, right?
Right.
So it's almost like there's something with that. And that's why I've said it, were these people pilled? Like, were they just like, okay, you know,
Mhm.
now enough of you. We're gonna
Right.
we're gonna, you know
Take you down. Yeah. Like, well, one example is Alex Jones.
Alex
Act-
Alex is so interesting because you were talking about this. We were talking a little bit about this after our last podcast,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and how he started to go. What year did he start to? I mean, he was always he was doing Infowars and kind of bringing
Yeah.
out.
So I used to listen to Alex Jones back in like 2009,
Mhm.
which is I think around when he first came out. And back then he never yelled. he he never yelled and he never like got so manic the way he is now. What happened was that he was doing a lot of deep dives. He was doing a lot of like heavy reporting on CIA, government, programs, all of these sorts of things. And the elite, the 1%, the global the global governments, things like that. And he did this one video, which I don't know if it's still available, but I remember he snuck into Bohemian Grove,
Mhm.
which is the meeting place for all of these 1% globalists to meet, to have like a week of kind of debauchery or just hang out and talk shop without nothing on the record.
Right,
Um, and there's also a weird kind of theatrical thespian um tone to it. So there's this old world connection to the theater and like plays and putting on performances as ritual. And so the theory is that they do actual rituals there and do sort of like sacrifices and things like that. So he was exposing that he snuck into Bohemian Grove. He showed video of this big owl statue, and
Mhm.
then everyone dressed in cloaks around a big fire and doing these incantations and chants. And it was probably literally immediately after that, he totally changed.
Really?
Like 2012. Yeah. He and then after that, I remember watching that and be like, "Oh, let's see what happens to him. He will either disappear
He
or."
got No, he got really addicted to painkillers was the story. So if you
Oh, sure.
that was I mean, that was the story, and that was why he that's kind of what came out. I don't know if it was exactly during that time or a little bit before that, but um that's wild. I mean, I know the story. I know that Bohemian Grove story. I've seen it,
Mhm,
and I've also seen the senator that he interviewed there. There was like there were I mean, it was heated. Um,
mhm.
the guy has balls. I mean, I have to give it to him. He would go in and do these crazy things even in the late 90s. I mean, there was stuff from him that was, you know, very just trying to uncover these truths. And then yeah, they took him down with the Sandy Hook story. And
Yeah.
what I think it was a bait, like a bait. I think that
Mm,
whatever happened at Sandy Hook, somebody from government told him it was a setup.
mm,
It did something to bait him into
interest
taking that on as a conspiracy.
well, or they MK Ultra'd him.
It
That's what
100%.
I think they MK Ultra'd him. I think they brainwashed him. I think they turned him into this, like, raging, just raged out
Lunatic.
guy, lunatic, who obviously is now discredited. No one would ever listen to anything that he has to say. So now everything that he's reported on previously to him losing his shit essentially is totally discredited. So,
Yes. Yeah, I mean, for the majority, right? And then there's still a small fraction of people who, trust him
mhm.
and whatever he's saying. I think, um
It is wild. The way that he talks now, it's impossible to listen to because he's just screaming and yelling the whole time. Before, he just never he
which
was
and that's so interesting because 'cause I've only heard him how he is now. I've not heard the before, you know?
I remember distinctly. I used to listen to him all the time, and I remember distinctly telling myself like, "Oh gosh, like, oh, I don't wanna listen to him anymore. He just sounds like so aggressive and angry, and he was starting to talk in a rhetoric that was political, which he never did before. He never talked about Democrats versus Republicans ever.
Really?
It was always against the 1%. It was always against the globalists. And then he started talking about the Democrats as if the liberals, they're these like, they're woke liberals trying to take control over blah blah blah. And like, I was like, this is so strange. I remember hearing certain terms that he'd never used before and thinking, like, this is bizarre. And he got more kind of Christian leaning, like more kind of right leaning. Like, he never really even talked about like Christianity. It was very much focused on globalists
Yeah.
and the 1%. And
Yeah.
then
Well,
it somehow got switched to like, yeah, Democrat like versus Republican.
I think in 2009, I wanna say, 2009, something called the Tea Party started, right? Do you remember the Tea Party? It was
Yeah, yeah.
which my godfather it's funny because most of the men in my life were always Republican, and whatever. So he was part of the Tea Party movement, which I think that that's how I tie Alex Jones in, but I'm not positive. I
Gotcha.
and so that there was, uh, that whole Tea Party thing that started because they came out against some of Obama's policy because of what Obama started to do. Now, I didn't see those things because I was living on a different, almost like I was living in Los Angeles. I wasn't seeing what my godfather was even talking about because it was like disconnected from what my reality was, especially at that time. And so when I think when they start to now go into this whole liberal, whatever wokeness or all what have you, it's almost like it's because it started then. I feel like
Mhm.
it all started then, and now it's just gotten to the point where there's two very different sides, and you can't really be in the middle anymore. You can be in the middle because that's where you want to be, but you can't really vote on the middle.
Right.
Nothing is in the middle. And so I don't know. I feel like it's almost like he's super on the right? He's like
Yeah.
right now.
He's
But I
yeah,
think
he
it's
used he would consider himself a libertarian back then,
yeah.
back in the
Yeah,
day.
I think that's what they were called. Yes, like the libertarian movement. Um I we always think, oh, there's got to be a third party that comes along, but it doesn't. I think that, to even tying this back to MKUltra and all the things that have gone on in the CIA, they want the divide to be there. There's something
Yep.
that it creates this whole world, creates fear, it creates it creates separateness, all the things. And so it's much easier to manipulate if there are
Yeah,
polar.
100%. And it's so much easier to predict how a group of people will react to certain information when you know their emotional connection to cultural or social issues. So that's also part of what the mind control program is about too. It's emotional manipulation. It's manipulating our emotions to make us act a certain way, because how do you take action? You have to feel something. Like, it starts with a thought, turns into an emotion, and then it becomes an action, to the point where you do it so much it becomes a belief.
Yes.
So they want to manipulate how we feel about any given thing so that we're easier to control. So for any certain topic, for any certain thing, Obama, for instance, you feel a certain way about Obama. So what do? We like drop this piece of information out about Obama, just to cause elation or something, or to cause depression. Like, it's just it's so manufactured. And I guess at the end of the day, what all of this should hopefully teach us is that the only true way to be free from this mental and emotional manipulation is to be very cognizant and self-aware of how you're feeling at any given time, and not relate to your thoughts, and not relate too heavily on your emotions at any given moment, because they change so easily. um because our thoughts are not who we are, and they're so easily manipulated. So but if you have a dissociation or a certain amount of um observational relationship with your thoughts, then you can see the patterns of where they come from, and you can see then, oh, well, that's not a thought that I want to have, so I'm going to change that. And then you become in control of the way that you navigate your life without fueling into, basically giving your energy, your feelings and your anger and your rage and your happiness and joy to someone else's program.
That's what it is, right? The program. We're all somehow being programmed or have been programmed in the past. So that's such a great way to like remember, just reminding ourselves we don't have to be a part of.
Mhm. Mhm.
I love that. It was such an interesting conversation, even though I feel a little ill prepared today, but I just, yeah, it's such an interesting sub topic, and yeah, I feel like there's still so much more. We could probably talk for another hour on it, but it's already been an hour and a half, so we should cut it. But thank you so much for bringing this information to me and us, and sharing your knowledge on it.
Oh my gosh, thanks so much for being open to hearing all of this, and
Oh,
also your wisdom too that you share and what you know about the topic. Um, Makes it really well-rounded and offers different perspectives and leads us into new and interesting caverns.
seriously. Yes, thank no, I appreciate that. I feel like I do so much research on so many different kind of whatever interests me, I will start to dive down, these rabbit holes on. And after we spoke last time, I just started to do a bunch of research on just like what that was about and what was really happening. And it's one of those things where it's like I feel like it's so obviously tied to some of the things going on in Hollywood, but it's like there's not a super strong thread, you know?
Right.
So it's like, it's still like, well, we don't have somebody who came out and said, "This is what happened to me." I mean, from our knowledge and the celebrity viewpoint. Though I
Right.
will say Kanye's kind of given hints to it, but I don't we
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's interesting. So thank you for opening our eyes and being here today.